Let me say this before we get started. I'm just reading. I'm just reading. And if I mess up, I don't care. If I mispronounce a word, I don't care. Let's get on to it. United States District Court, Southern District of New York, Cassandra Ventura versus Sean Combs. There's going to be certain things I'm just going to be skipping and all this stuff and everything like that. Like the Sean Combs, Bad Boy Entertainment, Bad Boy Records, Epic Records, Combs Enterprises, LLC. I'm not going to read it all over again the second time on the bad part. So, preliminary statement. Defendant Sean Combs is a rapper and record executive popularly known by his stage names Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, or Diddy. Mr. Combs came to fame in the early 1900s or 1990s, if y'all want to say it that way. With his record label, Bad Boy Records, he rose to prominence in the musical and entertainment industry over the decades and is regularly referred to as a hip-hop mogul. In 2022, Mr. Combs received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the BET Awards. During his acceptance speech is where it kicked it all off. Mr. Combs stated, "I have a special shout out. Thank you. Love the people that was really there for me." He named a number of people before adding, and also Cassie for holding me down in dark times. Love. Well, we going to find out about them dark times because the truth, however, is that Cassie, Miss Cassandra Ventura, was held down by Mr. Combs and endured over a decade of his violent behavior and disturbed demands. For Miss Ventura, the dark times were those she spent trapped by Mr. Combs in a cycle of abuse, violence, and trafficking. I will not be saying the SCX word, so you'll hear me either skip it or say X. If you don't like it, get the hell on. Peace be upon you. We getting on with this. Among other violent and unlawful acts, Mr. Combs took it from Miss Ventura, because I can't say the R word, so I will be saying take it. If y'all don't like it, once again, get on. Peace be upon you. Miss Ventura in her own home after she tried to leave him often punched, beat, kicked, stomped on Miss Ventura, resulted in bruises, burst lips, black eyes, and bleeding. Blew up a man's car after he learned that he was romantically interested in Miss Ventura. If y'all don't want to wait for that part, that is alleged to be Kid Cudi, and Kid Cudi said this 100% was true. Forced Miss Ventura into acts with male ex-workers while beating off and filming the encounters, ran out of his apartment with a firearm in pursuit of a rival industry executive who he learned was nearby, demanded that Miss Ventura to carry his firearm in her purse just to make her uncomfortable and demonstrate how dangerous he was, and introduced Miss Ventura to a lifestyle of excessive alcohol and substance abuse and require her to procure illicit prescriptions to satisfy his own addictions. Miss Ventura met Mr. Combs in 2005 when she was 19 years old and he was 37 years old. He signed her to his label, Bad Boy Records. Within a few years, lured Miss Ventura into an ostentatious, fast-paced and drug-fueled lifestyle and into a romantic relationship with him. Her boss, one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry, and a vicious, cruel, and controlling man nearly 2 decades her senior. Mr. Combs asserted complete control over Miss Ventura's personal and professional life, thereby ensuring her inability to escape his hold. He provided unprecedented avenues for success for the aspiring artist, but in return demanded obedience, loyalty, and silence. Throughout their relationship, Mr. Combs was prone to uncontrollable rage and frequently beat Miss Ventura savagely. These beatings were witnessed by Mr. Combs' staff and employees of Bad Boy Entertainment and Mr. Combs' related businesses, but no one dared to speak up against their frightening and ferocious boss. Following these episodes of horrific abuse, Mr. Combs would immediately attempt to hide Miss Ventura and the evidence of his violent rage. He often showered her with gifts following incidents of physical violence, a typical pattern of behavior by serial abusers. In addition to the physical assaults, Mr. Combs frequently reminded Miss Ventura of his ability to cause serious harm, whether by requiring her to carry his gun in her purse or by blowing up the car of a musician that was romantically interested in Miss Ventura. Adding insult to injury, Mr. Combs used illegal substances and threats of violence to force Miss Ventura into repeated unwanted encounters with male ex-workers. Over the years, Mr. Combs abused Miss Ventura physically and she again and again tried to escape his tight hold over her life. Every time she hid, Mr. Combs' vast network of corporations and affiliated entities found her, and those who worked for Mr. Combs' companies implored her to return to him. Many went as far as to explicitly state that her failure to return to Mr. Combs would hinder her success in the entertainment industry. When she believed that she finally separated from her longtime abuser, she joined Mr. Combs for a dinner, after which he forced her into her home and took it from her while she repeatedly said no and tried to push him away. Miss Ventura now fully escaped Mr. Combs, but the harm and assault and abuse that he caused her to experience for nearly a decade will forever haunt her. She has required intensive medical and psychological care to recover from the trauma she lived through. She cannot, however, continue to live in silence about what she endured. Mr. Combs remains immensely powerful and immensely dangerous. Miss Ventura therefore seeks justice for the decades of her life that Mr. Combs took away from her with threats of violence, excessive use of drugs, physical and psychological abuse, and ex-slavery. Accordingly, Miss Ventura brings this action seeking injunctive, declaratory, and monetary relief against defendants in violation of all these crimes that go from New York to California. I will not be reading those jurisdictions and venue. It's going to go once again through California and New York. Parties! Plaintiff Cassandra Ventura is a resident of the states of California and Connecticut and was employed by defendants of Bad Boy Records. We're not going to read all them damn LLCs and stuff like that. Basically, she was hired. She was an employee, and Sean Diddy Combs was her employer, defending the Bad Boy Entertainment, music, media, and all this stuff and everything like that. Basically, that run through New York and all these corporations. I'm not going to be reading that. Factual allegations. Here we go. This is really what I want to get to. Teenage Miss Ventura meets middle-aged Mr. Combs and her career begins. 24. Miss Ventura met Mr. Combs in late 2005 or early 2006 after Mr. Combs heard Miss Ventura's first single playing at a club and expressed interest in signing her to his label, Bad Boy Records. At this time, Miss Ventura was 19 years old. Mr. Combs was 37 years old. Within months, in February 2006, Miss Ventura signed a 10-album deal with Mr. Combs' record label. Miss Ventura's first album, Cassie, was released in August 2006, debuting at number 4 on the United States Billboard 200. To promote the album, Miss Ventura made TV appearances on MTV's Total Request Live and BET's 106 in Park. Miss Ventura suffered significant performance anxiety during these appearances, and press outlets were highly critical of Miss Ventura's performance on these shows. Mr. Combs, however, sought to rehabilitate his newly signed talent, telling MTV News, "You could hear the nervousness in her voice, and to be honest, kind of smiled at it because it made me really appreciate what I really love about her. She's a regular person. It made me just appreciate that she got nervous. It was kind of cute to me. To be honest, you got to understand that success for her is coming out of nowhere. It's just so huge, and sometimes everybody handles it differently. While clearly paternalistic in noting that it was cute to him how regular Miss Ventura appeared, Mr. Combs' comments rang true to some extent. Upon signing with Bad Boy Records, Miss Ventura was quickly thrust into the spotlight and was unfamiliar with how to navigate her new celebrity status, Mr. Combs' recognition and glorification of Miss Ventura's naivety proved to set the groundwork for his manipulative and coercive romantic and ex-relationship with Miss Ventura, a woman nearly 2 decades his junior. Within a year of signing with Bad Boy Records, Mr. Combs became deeply entrenched in Miss Ventura's life, almost immediately asserting possession and control over her life and inserting himself into all aspects of her career and personal life. In November 2006, Mr. Combs invited Miss Ventura to perform his song, Come to Me, along with him at MTV Europe Music Awards, Copenhagen, Denmark. After rehearsal for the performance, Mr. Combs walked around in a row with a drink in his hand, flaunting his lavish party lifestyle to his label newly signed artists. During hair and makeup leading up to the performance, Miss Ventura's hairstylist and Mr. Combs' makeup artist told Miss Ventura that Mr. Combs was interested in Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura shrugged off the gossip and, in fact, expressed disgust given the large age gap between her and the president of her record label, emphasizing the age and power dynamic early on in their work relationship, Mr. Combs positioned himself as a father figure and protector of Miss Ventura. By way of example, after returning to New York after a trip to Las Vegas, during which she endured a brief hospital stay, Miss Ventura, by then was fully healthy, went out to a club with her friends. When Mr. Combs saw her out, he reprimanded her, telling her to go home and take care of herself. At this time, Miss Ventura thought her record label was looking out for her well-being and that Mr. Combs had her best interests in mind. Mr. Combs also ensured he was interviewed with Miss Ventura's personal and social life. For instance, by inviting himself to Miss Ventura's 21st birthday party in Las Vegas, he also brought along famous musicians and producers, thereby flaunting his celebrity status and influence in front of a young and personable Miss Ventura. Although Mr. Combs knew that Miss Ventura was in a relationship at the time, and even though he was publicly in a relationship with Kim Porter, Mr. Combs nevertheless pursued Miss Ventura after an after party in a hotel suite following Miss Ventura's 21st birthday party. Mr. Combs pulled Miss Ventura to a bathroom and forcibly kissed her. Miss Ventura did not consent to this unwanted contact. She immediately ran out the bathroom and hotel suite and cried. She told her best friend at the time about what happened, but was too scared to tell anyone else. At the Video Music Awards the following day, Miss Ventura's boyfriend at the time joined her and Mr. Combs at a table at the awards ceremony. Mr. Combs became angry, telling Miss Ventura that the invitation to the awards ceremony was only for her, not for her significant other. Mr. Combs lured Miss Ventura into a relationship. Despite clear rejection of Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs continued to demand Miss Ventura spend time with him, including for a weekend at Mr. Combs' residence in Miami and for nights out in New York City. On one particular night around September 2007, Mr. Combs insisted on taking Miss Ventura out. Miss Ventura acquiesced, fearing that rejection Mr. Combs' request would have repercussions for her album deal with Mr. Combs and his company, Bad Boy Records. Mr. Combs picked up Miss Ventura from her apartment in Manhattan in a blue luxury vehicle. Miss Ventura was surprised that when she got into the car, Mr. Combs was already inebriated. He handed her a pill and told her to take it. When Miss Ventura asked what the pill was, Mr. Combs dismissed her and told her she would like it. She later learned the pill was ecstasy, something Miss Ventura had never tried before and did not want to try. This was the first time Mr. Combs got Miss Ventura high. Mr. Combs then proceeded to drive recklessly at high speeds down the West Side Highway of Manhattan. Miss Ventura was scared but did not dare to object to Mr. Combs, who appeared drunk, high, and agitated. Mr. Combs took Miss Ventura to an upscale lounge in downtown Manhattan, where he proceeded to get into an altercation with the security staff, who would not permit Mr. Combs to enter, presumably because he was belligerent. Miss Ventura decided to go home, but for the remainder of the night, Mr. Combs messaged Miss Ventura in excessively complaining that it's supposed to say that she, but it says complaining that he left him high and alone. In early fall 2007, Mr. Combs flexed his power and influence when he paid a promoter to create a fake flyer for a party hosted by Miss Ventura. This fake posting allowed Miss Ventura to have an excuse to go to Miami, Florida, and to get her away from her boyfriend using the guise of a legitimate event she had to attend. Miss Ventura, stunned at how easily Mr. Combs was able to recruit others to lie for him, Miss Ventura was uncomfortable with the fake flyer because the request to go to Miami was made by the owner of her record label, and because she was scared to go against his wishes and face repercussions to her nascent career, Miss Ventura agreed to join Mr. Combs in Florida. During this trip to Miami, Mr. Combs provided Miss Ventura with a copious amount of drugs. She became more intoxicated than she ever had before, and her intoxication lasted throughout the weekend's trip. As she wanted Mr. Combs to continue to support her career, she felt she could not refuse Mr. Combs, urging her to take more drugs. After providing her with drugs, Mr. Combs had intercourse with her, Miss Ventura, during this trip. Within 2 years of meeting Mr. Combs, Miss Ventura found herself lured into the immediate circle of her boss, the owner of her record label, and one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry. Mr. Combs exerts control over Miss Ventura's career and personal life. From the very start of their relationship, Mr. Combs exerted his power and influence over Miss Ventura. The dynamic was fueled by their nearly 24-year age difference, as well as their relative positions in the entertainment industry, with Mr. Combs considered a music mogul. Miss Ventura, at the very start of her career as an entertainer, Mr. Combs' aggressively and demanding approach to those he worked with made it impossible for anyone to challenge him. Miss Ventura soon learned that Mr. Combs insisted on blind loyalty from everyone in his inner circle. Although Miss Ventura saved up some earnings from her young modeling career, Mr. Combs' ostentatious display of wealth was intimidating to her. Mr. Combs paid for things with wads of cash and would repeatedly tell Miss Ventura, "Don't worry about the money. I have money." Mr. Combs' expensive, lavish vacations for him and Miss Ventura, purchased a car for her, paid for her apartment, and provided her with extensive amounts of designer clothing. Around 2008 or 2009, Mr. Combs began to rent an apartment in Manhattan for Miss Ventura. The apartment was within walking distance of Mr. Combs' New York residence. He first showed Miss Ventura the apartment by bringing her there along with her parents. Miss Ventura's parents were skeptical of the mogul's displays of wealth, but proud of their daughter's newfound success. In 2010, Mr. Combs similarly paid for an apartment for Miss Ventura in Los Angeles, which was located 5 minutes away from Mr. Combs' residence. He paid for many of her apartments in California and also purchased a Jaguar for her around 2013 or 2014. All aspects of Miss Ventura's life were controlled were controlled by either Mr. Combs or his management companies. Every event Miss Ventura attended, from the travel to the makeup and clothing, was paid directly by Mr. Combs and his affiliated companies, compounding this all-encompassing intrusion into her life. Let me redo this. Compounding this all-encompassing intrusion into her life, Mr. Combs secured his control over the young and impersonable Miss Ventura by introducing her to drug-fueled lifestyle that kept her complacent and complaint. Mr. Combs first introduced Miss Ventura to opiates around 2008 and would often have pills and other drugs out in the open like candy. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs has been addicted to prescription painkillers and took ecstasy frequently. At first, Miss Ventura was given the prescriptions that Mr. Combs received from a doctor in Miami, Florida. Eventually, when Mr. Combs exhausted his supply of pills, he demanded that Miss Ventura procure prescriptions from this Miami doctor in her own name. Mr. Combs became deeply involved in Miss Ventura's personal life, with his personal staff attending Miss Ventura's day-to-day travel and other needs, including medical care. On multiple occasions, Mr. Combs had Miss Ventura's personal medical records sent directly to his email address. For instance, when Miss Ventura began experiencing memory loss, potentially due to excessive drug use and or head injuries caused by Mr. Combs' beatings, as described below, her MRI results were provided directly to Mr. Combs. Mr. Combs also repeatedly arranged for his staff to drive Miss Ventura to certain doctor's appointments. In this way, Mr. Combs exerted ownership over Miss Ventura. As another example of the ways in which he manipulated Miss Ventura and ensured obedience. Early on in their relationship, he asked Miss Ventura what she called her grandfather. When Miss Ventura said she referred to her grandfather as Pop Pop, Mr. Combs perversely insisted that Miss Ventura refer to him with the same name. I'm sorry, what the fuck? Bruh, what the hell? Nigga, you want to be called Pop Pop, cuz? All right, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura's relationship becomes violent and abusive. What started as a whirlwind of celebrity meetings and drug and alcohol-fueled parties, however, quickly turned frightening and violent. Miss Ventura was also exposed to the intense violence that pervaded Mr. Combs' rise to fame. For example, on one occasion when Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura were using drugs together in his home, one of his security staff barged in, announced that Suge Knight, a longtime rival of Mr. Combs, was spotted at Mel's Drive-In Diner in Los Angeles. Mr. Combs began to get dressed, retrieved multiple guns from a safe, ran out of his home to where he believed Mr. Knight was dining. Miss Ventura became terrified and began to cry. On at least 2 occasions, Mr. Combs demanded that Miss Ventura hold Mr. Combs' gun in her purse. Miss Ventura had no familiarity with guns and was petrified that the firearm would accidentally go off in her purse. There was no reason why Mr. Combs required her to hold his guns except to reinforce to his young girlfriend that he was violent, powerful, and dangerous. I don't believe that part. I'm sorry. I don't. Over the next decade, multiple times each year, Mr. Combs would violently beat Miss Ventura, leaving bruises on her body. After every instance in which he beat Miss Ventura, Mr. Combs used his money power to orchestrate extensive efforts to hide the evidence of his abuse, including by hiding Miss Ventura in hotels for days at a time to let her bruises heal. In one instance, after a party with Jay-Z, Mr. Combs beat Miss Ventura repeatedly in an Escalade, including by kicking and hitting her. He forced her out of the vehicle on Fifth Avenue in New York City. She was eventually able to hail a cab and get to her apartment in Manhattan, where she cried in fear, realizing there was no one she could tell about what had happened at the hands of this incredibly powerful man. She spent the subsequent 3 days hiding in her apartment. In January 2009, after Mr. Combs learned that Miss Ventura spoke to another music manager at a party in Los Angeles, he became enraged. She had hoped speaking to this manager would allow her to further grow her career and that Mr. Combs would be happy for her, but instead he became extremely angry and pulled her out of the crib where the party was taking place. In the car, the club, Mr. Combs beat Miss Ventura, pushing her into a corner of the vehicle, stomping on her face. Mr. Combs' security staff, Roger Bonds, tried to stop the beating, but he was unable to de-escalate the situation. When the car arrived at Mr. Combs' residence, Miss Ventura attempted to run away, but Mr. Combs followed her, proceeded again to kick her in the face. Miss Ventura was bleeding profusely and was ushered into Mr. Combs' home, where she began to throw up from the violent assault. Upon recognizing the damage he had done and the physical evidence of the abuse, Mr. Combs panicked and forced his staff to bring Miss Ventura to a hotel at the London Hotel in Los Angeles, where she was required to stay for a week. During the stay, her injuries from the beating healed. Miss Ventura began to fully realize that Mr. Combs' tremendously loyal network not only knew about and witnessed his assault, but also these witnesses were not willing to do anything meaningful to stop Mr. Combs' behavior. She recognized that she was powerless, and by reporting Mr. Combs to the authorities would not alter Mr. Combs' status or influence, but would merely give Mr. Combs another excuse to hurt her. While in the hotel, she asked to go home to her parents, but Mr. Combs wouldn't let her leave. She lied to her mother when asked about an online gossip forum that reported the assault. Mr. Combs proceeded to instruct his assistants to purchase excessive amount of gifts for Miss Ventura, which were delivered to the hotel room where she remained trapped. Miss Ventura was terrified, isolated, and unable to see a pathway out of Mr. Combs' abusive hold on her life. She found herself becoming numb to the abuse she was experiencing and became entirely beholden to Mr. Combs' demands. She began to blindly follow his instructions out of fear of again beating on the receiving end of a vicious beating. By Mr. Combs' own admission, his relationship with Miss Ventura was like Bobby and Whitney, a clear acknowledgement of an unequal power dynamic and excessive domestic violence that premeditated their relationship. From the outside looking in, Miss Ventura had heard others refer to her relationship with Mr. Combs as akin to Ike and Tina, her volatile and abusive partner, who also owned her label and therefore held her future success in his hands, had fully exerted control over every aspect of her life. Mr. Combs forces Miss Ventura into trafficking. Within a few months of beginning a romantic relationship with 40-year-old Mr. Combs, the 22-year-old Miss Ventura felt beholden to his whims and demands. While in New York, Mr. Combs told Miss Ventura that he wanted to engage in a fantasy called voyeurism. Mr. Combs said that it would turn him on if he saw Miss Ventura with another dick. The first time Mr. Combs hired a man and brought him into his home in Los Angeles, the man, Mr. Combs, and Miss Ventura wore a masquerade mask and ingested drugs. Mr. Combs directed Miss Ventura to perform acts with this man while Mr. Combs watched. He masturbated while he directed Miss Ventura and the man to do specific acts. The entire encounter lasted multiple days. Mr. Combs began to call the arrangement a freak-off, or FO. He would repeatedly tell Miss Ventura at random moments that he wanted a FO. Miss Ventura was eventually expected to facilitate the location and the hiring of male workers. At certain points during Miss Ventura and Mr. Combs' relationship, he would insist on an FO weekly. Mr. Combs would repeatedly tell Miss Ventura that this practice was our thing and our secret. Nigga, you nasty as hell. FOs would often take place in hotel suites, including the Trump International Hotel in Columbus Circle, L'Hermitage, Beverly Hills, the London Hotel in Los Angeles, Intercontinental Century City, Intercontinental. We're not doing all this stuff and everything like that. On occasion, around 2013, Mr. Combs had an FO set up all the Intercontinental. What the hell? On one occasion around 2013, Mr. Combs had an FO set up at the Intercontinental Hotel in New York City, after which he was charged with tens of thousands of dollars in damages by the hotel. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs' chief of staff, Tony Fletcher, paid the invoice charged by the hotel. Ms. Ventura was eventually instructed to use websites and escorts to find male workers to participate FOs. Mr. Combs told Ms. Ventura to search for large black penises on the website. Sometimes Mr. Combs would pay for male workers to his location, including multiple cities in the United States, as well as abroad. He required Ms. Ventura and his staff help him make these arrangements. Mr. Combs' assistants would help set up the FOs, including by setting up the hotel suites with baby oil and astroglide. Mr. Combs always supplied Miss Ventura and the workers with copious amount of drugs before and during the FOs. Miss Ventura was given ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and alcohol in excessive amounts during FOs, which allowed her to disassociate during these horrific encounters. It became commonplace to get IV fluids in days after an FO to recover from the excessive substances pushed upon her. Miss Ventura was required to dress up in lingerie for an FO. Mr. Combs insisted she wear white nail polish to contrast her fingernails with the skin of the black men he hired to have X with her. During the FO, Mr. Combs would instruct Miss Ventura to pour excessive amounts of oil on herself. I'm sorry, I know I'm not supposed to be laughing, but she ain't say nobody bent them over yet, so we'll see. Mr. Combs would then instruct Miss Ventura and the ex-workers to speak to each other and would specifically tell Miss Ventura where to touch the workers. Mr. Combs would say things like, grab that big black dick and ask her, how does it feel? I'm sorry, y'all. I'm sorry. As he directed her to perform for him. During FOs, in addition to directing Miss Ventura and masturbating, Mr. Combs would use his phone, laptop, and tablet to film Miss Ventura having X as hired sex worker. He treated the forced encounter as a personal art project, adjusting the candles he used for lighting to frame the videos he took. While Miss Ventura quickly deleted any photographs or videos of the acts if they were taken on her phone, Mr. Combs repeatedly made clear that he retained many videos of Miss Ventura during FOs. Even when she deleted the videos, Mr. Combs would tell Miss Ventura that he was able to recover deleted videos from her devices. On one occasion, he sat next to her on a flight and made her watch a video she thought she had deleted, reinforcing her inability to escape and the immense power he held over her. Mr. Combs would pay the male workers a few $1,000s in cash for their services. During some FOs, Mr. Combs would become extremely intoxicated and would hit Miss Ventura in front of the workers. Miss Ventura was repulsed by Mr. Combs' demands, but between the physical beating and recognizing his incredible power and incredible temper, Miss Ventura became petrified of her partner and boss and felt she could not say no. He even would present her with lavish gifts prior to or in the middle of the FO, seemingly acknowledging the ways in which these forced encounters constituted work for Miss Ventura and that he needed to compensate her for this work. At one point, he had even given her so many designer bracelets for the FOs and immediately following the brutal beatings that she felt she was shackled by his presence. Frequently, her anxiety before an FO would become so great that she would become physically ill, sometimes to the point of vomiting. While kneeling over the toilet, Mr. Combs would shame her into performing for him, eventually forcing her to get up and proceed with the encounter. She knew firsthand, telling Mr. Combs that she did not want to engage in FOs, was met with anger and violence. In addition, any suggestion that Miss Ventura would refuse the FO or otherwise report Mr. Combs' abuse was met with ultimatums by Mr. Combs, who would say that Miss Ventura could not go to the police because she had a lot to lose. Around August 2015, for example, in the middle of a surprise birthday dinner for Miss Ventura's 29th birthday, Mr. Combs insisted that Miss Ventura leave the party and go to a hotel for an FO. When she expressed that she did not want to go, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura cornered by his security staff in order to force her to leave with him. After this FO, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura went back to the hotel room that Miss Ventura was staying in, where some of Miss Ventura's friends were already hanging out. Mr. Combs was severely intoxicated at one point during the night, picked up some of Miss Ventura's friends like a child and dangled the friend over the balcony of the 17th floor hotel suite. Miss Ventura and her friends were scared by Mr. Combs' erratic behavior, but Miss Ventura was heavily sedated because of the drugs she took to participate in the FO, and therefore was unable to respond to Mr. Combs' terrifying behavior. The FOs became work for Miss Ventura, despite her protestations. Never heard of that word before. Mr. Combs insisted on these intricately staged forced encounters between Miss Ventura and various male workers. Miss Ventura tries to escape Mr. Combs' abuse. Anytime she tried to create distance between her and Mr. Combs, he used his networks to find her and convince her to return to his abuse. On multiple occasions, Mr. Combs sent his employers to lure Miss Ventura back. In 2021, during a rough patch in Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura's relationship, Miss Ventura had a brief relationship with musician Kid Cudi. When Mr. Combs returned from a trip, he demanded another FO from Miss Ventura. She acquiesced. During this FO, Mr. Combs found Miss Ventura's phone and found emails between her and Kid Cudi. Mr. Combs became enraged and proceeded to place a manual corkscrew between his fingers and lunged at Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura ran away to stay at Kid Cudi's home to escape Mr. Combs' wrath. Soon thereafter, one of Mr. Combs' staff members told Miss Ventura that he needed just to talk to Mr. Combs, even though Mr. Combs was enraged. Feeling like she could not escape Mr. Combs and his network of enforcers, Miss Ventura returned to Mr. Combs. He hit her several times, then kicked her in the back as she tried to run out the door. She went to her parents' home in Connecticut, where her mother took pictures of the bruises Mr. Combs had left on Miss Ventura's body. In February 2012, during Paris Fashion Week, Mr. Combs told Miss Ventura that he was going to blow up Kid Cudi's car and that he wanted to ensure that Kid Cudi was home with his friends when it happened. Around that time, Kid Cudi's car exploded in his driveway. Miss Ventura was terrified as she began to fully comprehend what Mr. Combs was both willing and able to do to those he believed had slighted him. In 2015, Miss Ventura spoke to a popular music manager at an after party in a hotel suite in Las Vegas. Mr. Combs saw her speaking to the manager and sternly told her to step into the bathroom adjoining the suite. In the bathroom, Mr. Combs beat Miss Ventura severely. She ran from corner to corner of the room, trying to avoid Mr. Combs beating and kicking. When she tried to lock herself in the bathroom, he pushed through, punched and kicked her while she was curled up under the toilet. Her screams were drowned by the loud music playing in the outside area of the hotel suite. When Mr. Combs, head of security, and assistant saw Miss Ventura after the assault, they began to cry. Miss Ventura had 2 black eyes, a burst and bruised lip, a huge welt on her forehead. Upon seeing the results of his vicious attack, Mr. Combs immediately took steps to conceal his wrongdoing. He forced Miss Ventura to stay at his home in Holmby Hills along with one of his sons. While there, Mr. Combs FaceTimed Miss Ventura and stated, "You gotta go up and put more makeup on. My son can't see you like that." She did put makeup on, per Mr. Combs' demand. Miss Ventura felt she had no choice but to obey her abuser. Even though security guards, assistants, and friends saw the situation she was in, no one dared to help her or speak up on her behalf. She therefore had no choice but to remain subservient. In later 2015, while shooting a movie in Cape Town, South Africa, Miss Ventura began a flirtatious relationship with an actor. She spent New Year's Eve with this actor, but Mr. Combs soon found out. Mr. Combs called the actor and threatened him. The actor proceeded to call Miss Ventura and tell her, "You really need to call Mr. Holmes." In or around March 2016, during an FO at the Intercontinental Hotel in Century City, Los Angeles, Mr. Combs became extremely intoxicated and punched Miss Ventura in the face, giving her a black eye. After he fell asleep, Miss Ventura tried to leave the hotel room, but as she exited, Mr. Combs woke up and began screaming at Miss Ventura. He followed her into the hallway of the hotel while yelling at her. He grabbed her, then took glass vases in the hallway and threw them at her, causing glass to crash around them. As she ran to the elevator to escape, she managed to get into the elevator, and when she got into the lobby, quickly took a cab to her apartment. Upon realizing that her running away would cause Mr. Combs to become even more angry with her and completely stuck in a vicious lifestyle of abuse, Miss Ventura returned to the hotel with the intention of apologizing for running away from her abuser. When she returned, the hotel security staff urged her to get back into the cab and go to her apartment, suggesting that they had seen the security footage showing Mr. Combs beating Miss Ventura and throwing glass at her in the hallway. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs paid the Intercontinental Century City $50,000 for the hallway security footage from that evening. After this, Miss Ventura left her home in Comstock and went to hide away at a friend's home in Florida. James Cruz, president of Bad Boy Management, tracked Miss Ventura down and told her that her single would not be released if she did not answer Mr. Combs' phone call. A woman worked at Sony Music reached out to her with a similar ultimatum concerning the record. Incredibly, Mr. Combs even convinced one of his attorneys to call Miss Ventura at this time. The lawyer told Miss Ventura it was in your best interest to call Mr. Combs back. Each time Miss Ventura tried to get away, Mr. Combs' this powerful network would force her back to him. Mr. Combs' tight hold over her lifestyle irreparably damaged her friendships. Around 2018, when Miss Ventura was with her friend Carrie Morgan in her house, Mr. Combs used his key to Miss Ventura's house and came in unannounced. Her and Miss Morgan had an altercation during which Mr. Combs threw a hanger at Miss Morgan. Upon information and belief, the incident resulted in a settlement between Mr. Combs and Miss Morgan, and Miss Ventura ended up paying Miss Morgan's additional funds in an attempt to resolve the dispute between her close friend and her abusive, controlling boyfriend. The relationship between Miss Ventura and Miss Morgan had been strained since the time. Seeing the excessive measures Mr. Combs took to keep a tight hold on Miss Ventura and isolate her from her support network, and having experienced the repercussions of rejecting his demands, Miss Ventura felt that saying no to Mr. Combs would cost her something: her family, her friends, her career, or even her life. Mr. Combs takes it from Miss Ventura. By 2017-2018, Miss Ventura became desperate to leave Mr. Combs in his abuse of her. She recognized that if she stayed with him, she would never be able to have a successful career or even be physically and mentally safe. She therefore became determined to completely break away from Mr. Combs and his lifestyle, in a cycle of abuse, and made concerted efforts to avoid him. In September 2018, she joined Mr. Combs at a dinner at an Italian restaurant in Malibu, California, for what she believed would be a discussion about concluding their relationship for good. After dinner, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura returned to Miss Ventura's home, which was paid for by Mr. Combs. Mr. Combs forced himself into her apartment and tried to kiss Miss Ventura. She told him to stop and attempted to push him away. Mr. Combs forcibly pulled off Miss Ventura's clothing, unbuckling his belt, and he proceeded to take it from Miss Ventura. She repeatedly said no as she tried to push him away. Soon thereafter, Miss Ventura took steps to completely separate herself from her longtime abuser, including by leaving the home that he paid for and returning the car he purchased her. Despite moving away, Miss Ventura's address was posted online in early 2019, leading to fears for her safety. Miss Ventura, who was under immense duress during the months after Mr. Combs took it from her, took all steps possible to entirely remove herself from her abusers ambit, including by entering into contracts to end her record deal with Bad Boy Entertainment. Mr. Combs' abuse and physical abuse of Miss Ventura has caused her lifelong harm. As a result of the immense trauma Miss Ventura endured over a decade with Mr. Combs, she has suffered and continues to suffer from immense emotional distress. Following her escape from the cycle of abuse and trafficking she struggled with the physical and mental manifestations of her trauma. The birth of her 2 children, however, allowed her a new lease on life and gave her purpose. She credits her children with saving her from the trauma that had consumed her over a decade of her life. Except for the months when she was pregnant with her children, Miss Ventura struggled with her addictions to drugs and alcohol, addictions that were established and fueled by Mr. Combs. She turned to substances to drown out the memories of her abuse without being intoxicated. She suffered from horrific nightmares and forced acts that Mr. Combs demanded that she participated in during the regularly scheduled FOs and the physical beatings that she endured throughout their relationship. She had difficulty eating or sleeping, and her relationships with her family suffered. During this time, she frequently had thoughts of ending her life to rebuild her life. To rebuild her life and career. Miss Ventura needed to completely reinvent herself. She checked herself into an inpatient treatment at a rehabilitation center where she first confronted the extent of the trauma she lives with. She was required extensive therapy and other medical care to recover from Mr. Combs' abuse, and she will forever live with the physical and psychological repercussions of the over a decade violence, fear, and exploitation she endured. Although Miss Ventura was unable to speak up for herself, the years of abuse she endured at the hands of Mr. Combs, she has since been able to rebuild her life and confront her trauma. Thanks to the passage of New York's Adult Survivors Act and California's Abuse Accountability and Cover-Up Act, she is now ready to confront her abuser and to hold him and those who enabled those who enabled his abuse to be accountable for their actions. They ain't putting in a lot of this stuff. First cause of action, we're not going to get into all that because this is all basically the same stuff. Basically saying that here are the states that it happened in. Here are the charges. For one, plaintiff repeats and realleges each and every allegation in all of the preceding paragraphs as if fully set forth herein, and performing the conduct described above. Defendant committed a battery against plaintiff because he intentionally engaged in unlawful, intentional, and offensive touching and application of force to plaintiff's person. So basically all the crimes that she alleged that he did from California to New York. So if y'all want all of this stuff and everything like that, basically you can have it. But and this was filed 5th Avenue, New York. And yeah. Do I believe he did it? I ain't gonna hold you. Hell yeah. I'm sorry. Do I believe this man? Do I believe he did it? Yeah. But is it possible he's innocent of this stuff, that she was whatever? Yeah, but a decades long thing of this shit and everything like that, bro. Like, some of this, and some people will say, hey, why didn't she report it to the police and all this stuff and everything like that? I can understand and believe her being scared. So we'll just see.